Good morning. Welcome to our presentation on epoxy grout. My name is Mike Granachowski. I'll be the presenter today. And what we're going to be talking about, epoxy grout, is it that difficult to install? We so often hear from contractors that they don't want to work with epoxy grout. It's difficult to work with, it's difficult to install, various issues with it. And what we're going to be showing you today is that there's been a lot of changes in epoxy grout, and to working with an epoxy grout is not that difficult. This presentation will be done both with videos or with a slide presentation, and also a little bit later with a quick 7-minute video. A little bit about myself. I'm the National Director of the Architectural and Commercial Project Program for MAPEI, and I've been with MAPEI for 20 years. Been in the flooring industry, primarily tile and stone installations, for over 40 years. And I've worked both in installation, distribution, sales. And with my tenure with MAPEI, I've been working primarily with the architectural community on national accounts, major architectural firms, and larger projects. I graduated from the University of Arizona, where I studied architecture and ended up with a degree in business administration. Currently living in Southern California in Park City, Utah, active in Construction Specification Institute, or the CSI, love cycling and skiing. So that's a little bit about me and my background. So what we're going to be looking at today is epoxy grout, understanding the challenges of epoxy grout. We're going to take a look at, on this presentation, the differences between epoxy grout and other types of grouts, so they have an understanding what really is an epoxy, and making sure that when you're specifying out an epoxy grout for your project, that you're actually getting an epoxy grout and not some other type of grout. We'll be looking at the differences in that. We're going to look at selecting the right type of epoxy grout for the application, making sure that we're looking at 100% solids epoxy and not a modified epoxy or some other version of it. We're going to also take a look at what in an industrial epoxy, what is needed for an industrial epoxy grout installation, and how to properly call it out in your specification. And then finally, we're going to be viewing an actual installation of industrial grade epoxy grout, so that you can see it's not that difficult to put in, it's not that difficult to work with, and there's no reason that when it's needed on your job, it shouldn't, or it should be used on your project. So let's take a look a little bit about grout itself. What's the purpose of grout? Grout is used primarily to be more sanitary, so we're filling up the joints between the tile, preventing dirt from getting in there, or contamination in between the tiles. It's meant to keep water out of going down into the tile installation and then underneath the tile. Remember that grout is not waterproof. Even if it's an epoxy, it's not a waterproof grout. Moisture can still seep in through it, but it does help keep water out. It protects the tile edges. If it's a square edge tile, you're filling up the grout joint completely so that you're not getting chips along the edges. If it's a cushioned edge tile, the grout is at a level where it drops down to the level of cushion. But basically, it's protecting the edges of the tile. Grout's used to either contrast or blend with the tile, depending upon the look that the designer is after. Do they want to accent the individual tiles, make them pop and showing the difference in color, or do they want more of a monochromatic look and having the grout blend in? The range of colors now that are available in grout, you can do either types of application. It also fills in the gap between the tiles to allow for the expansion, contraction of the tile floor, and picking up the movement in that floor. Grout also allows for slight irregularities in the substrate and the tile. So grout is used in the sense of correcting a lot of imperfections minor imperfections in an installation. Hiding maybe some of the variations in between the tiles, but the grout is used for hiding these types of imperfections. The grout serves a major purpose in the installation. So when we're taking a look at types of grouts for ceramic tile, we reference back to the ANSI specifications. Your standard cement grouts meet ANSI 118.6. This is a blend of sand, cement, aggregates brought together to form a uniform, consistent grout. When I first started into the tile installation, a lot of the grout was job site mixed, where we would just take sand, cement, maybe adding in some cement coloring and coming up with a grout. Then with the development of other additives into it, moisture retarders into it, developed into your standard cement grout, which meets ANSI 118.6. In the last number of years, we've gotten into the ANSI specification 118.7, which is your high performance cement grouts. We'll get into a little more definition on these in just a minute, but they perform better than your traditional Portland cement grout. There's a lot of pros to these types of grouts and what they're doing. Recently, what we've seen on the market is the premixed or ready-to-use grout. This is a type of grout that comes in a bucket. You open it up, it's ready to use. There's different mixtures of it, the different types of ways of putting this type of grout together, which we'll explain in a few minutes. The biggest thing to realize that currently there are no ANSI standards for these ready-to-use grouts. The industry is currently working on that, and I'm sure shortly we'll be seeing actual standards for these ready-to-use grouts. Industry is moving more and more to this type of a grout. We also talk a little bit about modified epoxy emulsion grouts. It meets ANSI 118.8. It's an epoxy grout, but there's a big difference between it and 100% solid epoxy. ANSI 118.3 is your chemical resistant water cleanable epoxy grout. We'll be spending most of our time speaking about this type of a product. And then also we'll touch on epoxy or furane grouts, which are used in chemical plants and still used, more difficult to work with, but there is some usage of these grouts in various applications. So when we take a look at your basic cement grouts for ceramic tile or stone, your ANSI 118.6, the pros on this type of a grout is that it's cost competitive. It's the least expensive grout on the markets. You do have a range of colors. Just with MAPEI, we have 40 different colors in this. In our competition, have similar numbers of colors, but you find a full range of colors with these types of grouts. They're available both as sanded and unsanded. Typically, in an unsanded grout joint, you're going to use an unsanded grout joint where the joint is up to 1/8 of an inch in width. If it's more than that, we'll go into a sanded joint. Suitable for most applications, except when chemical resistance is needed. Getting into a chemical resistant grout, this type of grout won't hold up to it. The cons on this grout, it is a cement, and as a cement, it is susceptible to shading, discoloration. It'll can look different depending upon how much water was used to mix it, how much water was used to clean it up. It's very similar to when you take a look at your sidewalk. If you use too much water in a sidewalk mix, color becomes different than if you're using the proper amounts of water. Similarly, with a Portland cement grout, you can have shading based on how much water is used in mixing and how much water is used in cleaning up. It has a higher absorption rate, so it can stain. You're spilling the ketchup on it, and you will get staining into this grout. It should be sealed. It can be soft and powdery, depending upon the working conditions when it's installed. If it sets up too fast, it becomes soft. It's overmixed with water. It can also become soft and very easily scraped away. It should be sealed. This grout, to prevent this staining and soiling on this type of grout, you should use a sealer on it. Inconsistency in color, that's caused by the fact of how it's installed. It's not the product that's inconsistent in color. The applicator is either using too much water, not enough water, job site conditions, he's installing the sun is beating down on it, or air is blowing across the surface of the grout, it's going to change the color of that grout. It's not a problem with the grout, the way the job site conditions that were involved in installing that type of a product. Also, being a Portland cement, it is susceptible to efflorescence, that white chalky material that can be seen after grout installation, where water gets into it, free lime from Portland cement to the surface, dries and leaves that powdery residue. Efflorescence can be cleaned up, but it is unsightly, and people definitely don't want it on their job site. The next grout is the ANSI 118.7 cement-based grouts for ceramic tile, or a high-performance cement grout. The pros on this are this is a non-Portland cement grout. It's a calcium aluminate cement. With a calcium aluminate cement, you're using less water, and that means there's less water to be hydrated off or evaporate out. So we end up with a faster setting grout, a denser grout. This grout is typically less than 5% of absorption or porosity. The joint widths on this type of a grout can be as small as a 1/16 of an inch, all the way up to an inch wide. So you're not using both an unsanded and sanded grout. It's one type of grout. So on the distribution side of it or the application side of it, less inventory to be carrying around with you in doing your installation. One bag can go either the tight joint or all the way up into a wider joint. It is efflorescent resistant. Being a calcium aluminate cement, the way it hydrates out, you're not getting the free lime being pulled to the surface and leaving that white efflorescence residue on the surface of the tile. So doing exterior application, when being asked for a recommendation on any type of an exterior application, this for sure is the grout that we would start with and recommend, making sure that you as an applicator, you as an architect, are not ending up with the efflorescent problem at the end of an installation. Less shrinkage with this type of a grout, and it can be submerged in 72 hours. So doing a project that is a quicker turnaround time, let's say for example a swimming pool, that can be put underwater in 72 hours without any problem. The cons on this grout, it is still a cement. So that means it is still porous, even though it's a lot denser and harder, it can still be stained. So if red wine is spilled on it, it's not wiped up right away, you are going to find a staining into that grout. It should be sealed to help prevent staining or the impact of a lot of dirt into it. And the aggregate on this type of a grout can scratch soft finishes. So if you're using a softer glass tile or a metal finish tile, always do a test area prior to installing this type of grout. And we take a look at the ready to use or the premixed grouts. We're showing a picture of the MAPEI Flex Color CQ. This type of a grout has some properties of an epoxy, yet it is not an epoxy. We're seeing a lot of these products coming out onto the market, and some we're seeing advertising that just like epoxy grout. Well, yes and no. It'll repel a lot of soiling and staining like an epoxy, but it does not meet all the standards of ANSI 118.3 epoxy grout. So be careful when you're looking at these pre-mixed ready-to-use grouts that you're getting something that's going to work in your application. The pre-mixed polymer resin grout is a 1-part liquid, ready-to-use grout that requires no mixing with water. The advantage to this is that you open up the bucket, you bring it out and start applying it right away. Cleans up with water. And the other advantage is that any extra on this grout can be put back into the bucket, resealed, and will last up to a year on the shelf. Recently, I had an opportunity. I was cleaning out some stuff in the garage, and I had a bucket left over better than a year ago on this type of grout. Opened it up and found that it was still completely usable, and it was over a year old. But we say a year shelf life after it's been opened. We'll also remember that there are no installation standards or ANSI standards on this type of grout. So as a designing professional, if you're looking at including this into your spec and you're looking for ANSI standards, at this point, not yet. Soon to come, though. And we take a look at the pros on the ready to use. No mixing, so we can get it out of the bucket and start installing it right away. It's dust free, so as you're not adding a bag of powder into water and spinning it and having dust going across the air. The container can be resealed. It will fill into joints from as small as a 1/16 of an inch all the way up to a 1/2 inch. Will produce no efflorescence because it doesn't have any cement in it. It's flexible and crack resistant, and no sealing ever. The sealers just don't stick to it. The cons on this type of grout, it does have limited chemical resistance. So be careful that if you're looking for a grout for stronger chemical resistance, this is not the grout to be going to. It will hold up to the Coca-Cola, the coffee spills. It will even stand up to using it in a restroom and urine and that type of issues. Cannot be submerged. This is not to be used in a pool, a fountain, or submerged in water. So we often get the question, what about using it outside? Well, be thinking about it. Is this going to be used on an area where water might be ending up standing on it because of not proper slope, or snow or ice might accumulate on it? That would be a submerge. So before you get into using it outside, think about where you would be using it before you specify it in that application. It is slower to cure in lower temperatures. It takes a little more time. And there is a 7-day curing for heavier cleaning on this material. So curing times can take a little bit longer. And we start looking at the epoxy-based grout for ceramic tile. One of the first epoxy grouts that I used years ago was these modified epoxy grouts. They comply with ANSI 118.8, modified epoxy emulsion. It's used both as a grout and a mortar. The other epoxy-based grouts are 118.3, your chemically resistant water cleanable tile, both setting material and grout. And then our ANSI standard for the installation is 108.6. And then finally, the chemical resistant, highly chemical resistant, like a furane or epoxy grout, is 118.5. And we're going to look at some differences in these when we're talking about epoxy grout, so you know what you're getting into when you're looking for an epoxy grout. On an epoxy-based grout, the 118.8, the modified emulsion, it primarily consists of emulsified epoxy resins and hardeners, and it's mixed with a pre-blended Portland cement and silica sand. So you still have Portland cement going into this product. These materials contain raw ingredients that will dissipate as the mixture cures. Therefore, they are not 100% solid. It's not 100% solid epoxy. These materials, when it was first introduced, were primarily used to bond tile to plywood before the better development of polymer-modified, latex-modified Portland cement mortar. But what we were seeing is as tile was being installed with wood, they were using these modified epoxy mortars, and then they were also used as a grout. But keep in mind that since there is a cement in this, certain things that will attack a cement will attack this grout also, keeping that in mind. Finally, get into our epoxy-based Grouts for ceramic tile, the ANSI 118.3, chemically resistant, water cleanable, can be used both as tile setting and grouting epoxy. It is 100% epoxy composition, 100% solids, composed of an epoxy resin, an epoxy hardener, and a powder that contains an aggregate. These grouts can be supplied in 2-part or 3-part combinations, so you're mixing various components together. The important thing about mixing these is that make sure you're mixing the full units. Don't play chemist on the job. Don't be going, oh, I only need a small amount, so I'll pre-measure out an amount and this will work. These grouts and epoxy grouts are pre-packaged, giving you the right combinations of liquids and powders and hardeners to be mixed together to form a solid epoxy grout. If you start playing scientist or chemist on the job and mixing partial amounts, typically there'll be a failure because you're not getting enough resin in it, enough hardener in it, it doesn't set up right, and it's a failure. And trust me, a failure costs you a lot more money than what the unit of epoxy will cost you. These units of epoxy do come in various sizes, so if you don't need a larger unit, order something smaller, but always mix a complete unit. Don't try mixing partial amounts of it to saving yourself a few dollars. It is a thermal set cure with epoxy, meaning that as you mix it together and you put your hands around the bucket, you'll feel that the bucket is heating up because of the chemical reaction. So in working with epoxies, and after you've properly mixed it, it's best to get it out of the bucket and onto the floor, spread out sooner than later, so that it gives you more working time with the material. Also, after you've mixed the first unit and you go to mix another unit, if you have residual from the first unit still in that bucket, it's going off. And as you add fresh epoxy into it, it's going to set off the fresh epoxy faster. So it's best to make sure you've cleaned out the bucket completely before you start mixing a second unit to prevent the epoxy from setting up quicker. After mixing, but before curing, these epoxy grouts can be cleaned up with water. That's the advantage. Years ago, when I was working in the field and doing installation, the epoxy grouts were a lot different. We would have to use hot water, and we would have water heaters there, and getting hot water together to cleaning it up. Some of the epoxies, because they were so aggressive, we would pre-wax the tile or order wax tile, especially if it's unglazed, so that when you went to clean it up, you would steam the wax off the surface of the tile and the epoxy would come off of it. Times have changed. The epoxies have been reformulated, a lot easier to work with, a lot easier to install. The biggest thing with an epoxy is making sure that when you're cleaning it up, that you're picking up all of the residual so that you're not running it down into a drain or causing other problems. True story, a number of years ago, worked on a winery where we were steam cleaning off the epoxy, and we had failed to plug a drain, and all of the water and residual went down into the drain, and it hardened in the drain. Needless to say, we had to come in and pay for the removal of not only the tile, but the substrate, and putting in a new drainage pipe because of the fact that the epoxy hardened in there. So be aware of these things when you're working with an epoxy, to making sure that you're not letting this run off into drains and such. You're capturing your runoff water, collecting it properly, and disposing of it properly. Again, when we talk about the epoxy, 100% solids epoxies, early formulas were difficult to use, as I explained. A lot of the times wax tiles to make it easier to clean off with steam cleaning, or you needed to use hot water to clean it up. So you were heating water on the job site to make it easier to clean up. The earlier formulas had very few colors to choose from, very limited in that. It was used primarily on commercial or industrial applications where chemical resistance is needed or was needed. The one advantage, it's highly resistant to chemicals and staining, so that meat processing plants, cheese factories, food prep areas, epoxy was the way of going. And as we've seen newer formulas being developed, have become a lot more user-friendly and easier to clean. In a lot of the epoxies, there's not a pigment in the grout. In our Epoxy CQ, it's a coated quartz that the aggregate itself is the color. And so that makes it a lot easier to clean up, and you're not leaving a residual of color behind. I know that years ago, working with a black epoxy grout was very difficult because it seemed like you were just constantly smearing black. But now with the coated quartz type of aggregate, very easy to clean up and not leaving this black residue behind if you're using a dark grout. We're starting to see that a lot of the epoxy grouts being used in residences where the homeowner doesn't want to deal with sealing grout, and they want to make sure that this a light colored grout, or the grout that they picked out, isn't going to get stained from a spill of wine or ketchup or household use. So they use more and more use of epoxy grout in residences. There's a lot more colors that are available in the MAPEI line. All 40 of our standard colors are also made in our regular epoxy grouts. Then what we started seeing is that decorative grouts, there's a lot of options that are starting to be included, including glitter and glow-in-the-dark types of epoxy grouts. Common uses of epoxy grouts is the industrial grade grout is used in areas vulnerable to maintenance with enzymatic or no rinse cleaners. This is an important point to keep into consideration. A number of years ago, we started seeing some problems that epoxy grout was disappearing, was being eaten away, and we're in researching what was going on. We found that enzymatic cleaners or no rinse cleaners were being used on floors. These, if you've ever worked in a kitchen and had to mop up a floor at the end of the evening, these enzymatic no rinse cleaners are ideal. You could get the floor clean, get out of your cleaning a lot quicker. The next day you come in and the floor was ready to go nice and clean. The industry didn't realize when they introduced these cleaners is that these cleaners, in combination with certain fats and acids, form what's called an oleic acid, which can be very caustic to eating up a traditional epoxy grout, destroy a cement grout very, very quickly. So when you're dealing with olive oil and chicken fat are two of the items that are most prevalent, mixed with these enzymatic cleaners, from this oleic acid and attack a traditional epoxy grout. So we came out, not only MAPEI, but other companies also came out with an industrial grade of epoxy grout. We call ours Epoxy IEG CQ. And this should always be used in any food prep areas, back of the house and kitchens, anywhere where you're looking at for a higher chemical resistance. And as a design team, you don't know once you've turned this project over what they're going to be using for cleaning. And if the owner of the building starts using these enzymatic cleaners, we don't need problems later on down the road. So it's best for in these areas of any food prep or some of these other commercial applications to using the industrial grade of an epoxy grout. So keep in mind for commercial kitchens, meat processing, commercial dog kennels, milking barns and dairies, breweries, soft drink manufacturing, all areas where that industrial grade of an epoxy grout should be used. And this is where we run into so often problems where the installer says, it's so difficult to work with. We want to use a regular epoxy or a standard cement grout. You don't need that because it's so much harder to install. And this is what we're going to be showing you in a minute, that it's not that difficult. this is kind of a little bit of a repeat of what I was just saying. Standard epoxy grouts were susceptible to deterioration from enzymatic no-rinse cleaners. The newer industrial grades were developed to cope with these harsh chemical environments. Industrial grade grouts are tested in accordance with ASTM C267, and each manufacturer has a list of chemicals showing their grout's degree of resistance. So as you're looking at calling out that industrial grade of grout for the back of the house kitchen, for a processing plant, take a look at what that grout will stand up to. And all of the manufacturers of these industrial grade grouts have attested to showing you what you're actually getting. Most industrial grade epoxies are comparable to furane epoxies in physical strength and chemical resistance. Furane is still on the market. You're seeing less and less of it being used because these industrial grade epoxy grouts have become easier to install than the furane grouts. So pros on an epoxy-based grout: no sealers, less costly in the maintenance. So yes, the installation cost might be more, the materials might cost more, but the ROI for your end user is going to pay for itself in the lessening of maintenance with these types of grouts. Excellent chemical resistant, color resistant, and stain resistant. Of course, you won't get any efflorescence with it because there's no cement in it. Can be used for both walls and floors, and the ability to work with it is greatly improved, a lot easier to work with. Cons: yes, you are mixing 2 or 3 parts need to be mixed together, and they need to be mixed together accurately to making sure that this grout sets up and sets up properly. It is a chemical reaction, so when they're saying mix all of part A with all of part B and adding in the powder, following that explicitly to making sure that it sets up properly and works properly. Shorter working time with these types of grouts, getting it out of the bucket, spreading it onto the floor. You're not going to spread as much of an area before you start washing. Cleanup can take a little more time. It is more expensive for both material and labor, and it should be done by an experienced installer. Somebody saying, "Oh, I've done grout, I can put in epoxy." No, they need to have some training with it, working with it to understand what's involved in getting it out of the bucket, spread, and cleaned up so that there isn't a problem after the installation. We're going to go into a short little video and showing how epoxy grout can be installed. And this is a quick 7-minute video, give you a good understanding of the industrial grade of epoxy grout and showing it being installed on an actual kitchen floor.
This video will focus on MAPEI's Carapoxy IEG CQ installation techniques for quarry tile in a commercial kitchen. The Carapoxy IEG CQ kit includes all of the components listed here. It can yield up to 4 gallons of grout. Carapoxy IEG CQ is made of a Part A resin, a Part B hardener, and a Part C colored quartz aggregate. All 3 parts are required. Be sure that the grout joints are clean and that 2/3 of the total joint depth is free of mortar, per the ANSI A108.5 installation procedure for epoxies. Insert a foam backer rod into the expansion joint between the cove base and the floor, per ANSI and TCNA standards. This will protect the joint from being filled with grout. Tape off the section of floor on which you will be working. This way you will know which grout joints are clean and which are not. It is important when working with Carapoxy IEG CQ that you do not mix partial units. To avoid a possible skin reaction, wear proper personal protective equipment. First, mix Part A and Part B in a mixing bucket with a 300 RPM mixer. Mix entire units at a time. When the color is consistent, slowly add Part C. Mix thoroughly until a homogeneous, consistent color is achieved. Avoid prolonged mixing, which can trap air and shorten the pot life. Once Carapoxy IEG CQ is completely mixed, It must be installed within 1 hour maximum, or the product will not properly install. To lengthen the working time in hot weather, keep parts A and B on ice for 15 minutes before mixing. Set the mixing bucket in a cold water bath. If Ultra Care grout release is not used, dampen the tiles before installation, but tiles should not be so wet as to have pooled water. When you're grouting more than 500 square feet, it's best to use a two-man team. This allows you to mix more units of parts A, B, and C at a time. If you are a single installer, we recommend mixing 1 unit of parts A, B, and C at a time. For typical tiles measuring of 6 by 6 by 1/2 with a 1/4 inch joint width, the coverage for 1 mixed unit of Epoxy IEG CQ would be about 40 square feet. Remove mixed product from the container, pouring it in a ribbon or placing it in small piles on the tile surface. Epoxy IEG CQ is a thermosetting product, so it sets up faster in a container or in a large mass. A two-man team may mix 2 or 3 units of parts A, B, and C and grout 80 to 120 square feet at a time. A single installer may mix 1 unit of parts A, B, and C at a time to cover about 40 square feet. Whether working alone or in a team, this process should take 20 to 30 minutes. Always use directional floating. This means holding the float at a 90-degree angle to the floor and pulling the grout in 45-degree angle to the face of the tile. Use a hard rubber epoxy float with a sharp edge to continuously force grout into the joints. Make sure that all joints are well compacted and are free of voids and gaps. Fill joints with the maximum amount of grout possible. Before the excess epoxy begins to set, remove it from the tile surface with the edge of the float, holding the float at a 90-degree angle and pulling it diagonally at a 45-degree angle across the joints. Grout joints should look full and flush to the top of the tile surface. For the initial cleaning, dilute each initial wash cleaning additive packet from the kit with 2 gallons or 7.57 liters of clean water. Liberally spread the cleaning mixture onto the grouted area and scrub with a white nylon scrub pad from the kit, using circular motions to remove the grout from the tile surface. Then remove the wash water by dragging a sponge from the kit diagonally across the joints, flipping to the sponge's other side after each pass. Rinse the sponge after both sides are used for a pass. Be sure to change the water in the buckets after using each unit for grouting. Do not leave any standing water on the tile surface or in the joints, because this can cause epoxy residue or grout haze. Knee pads and toes of shoes can press on newly installed joints, causing the grout to bulge and indent. Unfortunately, these indents don't always appear right away because during the cleaning process they fill with soft residue. This soft debris breaks free after the grout is hardened and suddenly an indent appears. For this reason, we recommend the use of a knee board or even a 5-gallon plastic lid to protect the grouted joints and prevent indentations. Work in smaller sections to clean grout from the tile surface before it dries. Always use clean water. Change the water every 40 square feet and be sure to keep the water out of the ungrouted grout joints. If water does get into the empty joints, use a shop vacuum to remove it. After the initial cleaning, wait 5 to 10 minutes. Now begin the final cleaning of the floor. Dilute each final wash cleaning additive packet from the kit with 2 gallons or 7.57 liters of clean water. Liberally spread the cleaning mixture onto the grouted area and scrub with a new white nylon scrub pad from the kit, using circular motions to remove the grout residue. Use a clean sponge included in the kit and pull it diagonally across the floor to remove any remaining grout haze or residue. Use a clean, wet microfiber or cotton towel and pull it diagonally across the tile to remove any excess water. Again, leave no standing water on the tile surface or in the grout joints to prevent epoxy residue and grout haze. The entire process of installing the Epoxy IEG CQ kit from start to finish should take no more than 45 minutes to 1 hour. Once the surface is dry and before it is covered, check for haze or imperfections. The epoxy resin will bond to itself, so repairs are relatively easy and will blend into the joint. Following the previously detailed steps, mix a kit and trowel grout onto any spots in need of repair. If grout is applied, clean floor as previously detailed. Remove any haze with MAPEI's Ultra Care Epoxy Grout Haze Remover. Remove grouted backer rod from cove base and install fresh backer rod per ANSI and TCNA standards. This will create a two-sided bond and prevent the sealant from tearing as the floor moves through its normal cycle of expansion and contraction. Install MAPEI's MAPEIUSA T 100% silicone sealant to the expansion joint running around the floor's perimeter between the cove base and the floor. Spraying the sealant with water diluted with a small amount of dish soap will help prevent sticking to your tool. If possible, wait at least 4 hours before covering the grouted area. If you must cover it to protect it, use craft paper or ram board. And finally, protect the tiles and prevent foot traffic for 24 hours during curing. Using MAPEI's full system of products along with Epoxy IEG CQ will ensure that your floor will receive a system warranty from MAPEI. For further information, contact MAPEI Technical Services at 1-800-992-6273 in the U.S. and Puerto Rico, or at 1-800-361-9309 in Canada, or simply visit www.mapei.com.